Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of To The Point podcast. I'm Rachael Lyon, here with my co-host, Jonathan Knepher. John, hi.
Hi, Rachel. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, but I have to say it's been one of those weeks. I don't know if it's like that for you, where on Tuesday I thought it was Friday because so much had already happened.
Oh yeah, same over here. We have been busy with lots going on. It's coming through the end of the new year with all of your projects getting into high gear to
Yep,
show that Q1 got everything done, right?
that's right. That time of year, everything kicks in on steroids for sure.
Yep.
But I love it. It's good to be busy. Kind of keeps
Yes.
you out of trouble. So we'll take it. So I'm really excited to welcome this week's guest, Trevor Hilligoss. He is Senior Vice President at SpyCloud Labs. Now, they are a cybercrime research group dedicated to uncovering and analyzing intricate patterns from the criminal underground. How cool is that? But he's also a member of the Joint Ransomware Task Force and a recipient of the President's Volunteer Service Award for service aimed at countering cyber threats, among his many awesome expertise. So welcome, Trevor.
Hey, thanks for having me, Rachel and Jonathan.
All right,
Yeah.
so let's jump into this.
Yeah. So Trevor, thanks for joining us today. I'm super excited about our discussion here. But let's kick it off with reviewing the report that your team published recently. Can you go over like some of what were your biggest findings and very importantly for our listeners, how do these findings apply to organizations' approaches to cyber hygiene?
Yeah, great question, Jonathan. And the report you're referencing is our 2024 Malware and Ransomware Defense Report. This is a yearly report we try to put out to kind of educate the community and use some of our core insights from the data that we're collecting from the deep and dark web and our interactions with threat actors that we all know and love. Just to kind of highlight some of the things that we think are new and novel and are impactful. So my biggest takeaway really this year is Infostealers. I think for the past couple of years, it's interesting to see kind of, when I started looking at Infostealers back in, I guess 2018, 2019, they weren't super. I don't know. Maybe I'm the Infostealer hipster. That's a horrible thing to say. They weren't really like cool yet, right? Like they weren't used all that much. People weren't all that concerned with them. At least the majority of the community. And now we've seen this massive shift, right? In 2024, we saw the likes of Luma C2 just absolutely exploding. We saw older Infostealers like Redline, still holding strong. Obviously, that changed. Very happy to see last October in Operation Magnus, where there was a very significant disruption of Redline and Metastealer. But what we've seen is largely a shift. These are tools that are very attractive to a certain type of cyber criminal. They're very easy to use. They're very cheap. So when one falls, it's a bit of a hydra. We saw Redline go down and Luma C2 and Steel C popped up. So that's really my biggest takeaway is, it's all about the access. And whether you're talking about, something like ransomware or even lower, tier things that we tend not to focus on too much, like BEC or, some of the other kind of lower level scams, it all starts with access. It's an information game. And when you can run a stealer that is, it's in the name, right? Infostealer. For cheap, it unfortunately scales quite well.
So I'm kind of curious, and I feel like it's a topic we've talked a lot about, but you can't ignore the sophistication and evolution in tactics, with things like AI, but, malware, right? The prevalence of this, right? You can use AI to create new malware. We had someone at our company do that, using, I think it was like ChatGPT when it first came out. But what can organizations do to kind of mitigate this risk of, kind of losing, personally identifiable information? I think there's things like keyloggers and things like credential harvesting malware, but I think it's so much more sophisticated and broader than that, Trevor. And I'd be really interested in your perspective there.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. you know, for a long time, sophistication has kind of been a buzzword in the community, I guess. You know, we always want to talk about how sophisticated an actor is, or, you know, this is an APT and they've got a, you know, cyber range set up. They're so highly sophisticated. They've replicated your network on their, you know, in their office in St. Petersburg or whatever. Right. I kind of like turning that on its head a bit, though, because I think what's very interesting today and what has changed dramatically, I would say, over the past 4 to 5 years, is that sophistication is no longer quite as good of a barometer of success on the part of the adversary. And the reason that is true, in my view, is you have so many commodity tools. We talk about the cybercrime enablement services or the cybercrime ecosystem, right? And really what we're talking about is a very decentralized network of you know, criminal tooling, malware and malware adjacent tools and services that are highly available, very cheap, do not require much, if any, sophistication to really be quite dangerous with. And so what that does is it really lowers the barrier to entry, right? So when I started in cybercrime, you know, over a decade ago, most of our threat actors, even the cybercrime threat actors, not looking at the nation state folks as much, but they were highly sophisticated. I mean, these guys were smart, right? Really, really smart. And we certainly still have those actors today that are quite intelligent and quite dangerous. But the change is that you can be just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, as a very unsophisticated actor with just a couple Bitcoins, not even a couple Bitcoins these days, you know, a couple hundredths of a Bitcoin, roll it around in your crypto wallet, just enough to gain access to these tools and deploy them. So what that means for the enterprise, especially, is that, you know, your risk profile just got a lot more complicated,
right?
Because we're no longer just worrying about the very sophisticated adversaries. We're worrying about those, you know, we obviously got to still worry about those, but we're worrying about the ones that are have access to tools to be successful and really have no concern for what they damage on the way. And so, you know, it's the little things. It's making sure that you get good at the little things. Make sure you enforce MFA, have very short cookie timeouts. You know, don't allow BYOD policies, bring your own device policies. Because those are what's going to be impactful against the 99%, right? And then ideally that kind of frees you up infrastructure, you know, financially and time wise to focus on the 1% that are the real outliers, the real sophisticated folks.
So you're talking about you know, the availability of these tools to basically anybody who has criminal intent. Like, can you give us an idea on like what you're seeing that total scale means? Like, how big is this? And then from that, like, what kind of new technologies do we have to protect ourselves from those? Like, you mentioned policy things, but like, are there broader things we should be doing as well?
Yeah, great question. So scale's hard to analyze, right? I think SpyCloud, I'm biased, right? But I think SpyCloud has pretty good visibility. And, you know, from what we can see, I mean, we're seeing hundreds of thousands of infections a day. Those are mostly targeting Windows, operating devices running the Windows operating system. Although past couple of years, we've seen some commodity, by commodity, I just mean that, you know, you can go out and buy it. Commodity Infostealers targeting macOS. Atomic is one that's gained a lot of press, and we do see that to this day quite often. But, you know, we're talking about billions of devices, right? So what does that actually mean? Well, it's really a risk profile, I think, of the victim side, right? Like, I've never been infected by malware, at least not intentionally. I've certainly infected a lot of VMs with malware. But, you know, I'm not in that risky category. When we look at victims that are especially of the lower sophistication of quantity malware, you know, we see a pool that is roughly analogous to society, but definitely focused. You know, we trend younger. A lot of these infection vectors we see are gaming related. A lot of them are using things like ad services. So if you're clicking on ads, right, that puts you at a higher risk. So a lot of that is kind of behavioral indicators, I guess. And it's obviously that's very difficult. I could say that. It's fun to say that on a podcast. I'm not a CISO. I don't have to actually figure out how to solve that. But the behavioral side is really important. As far as what technology wise, what you can do, I am both optimistic and pessimistic in different ways on AI. I do think AI can augment the human analyst and be used as kind of a force multiplier, right? Take you got a set amount of hours in a day, you got a set amount of analysts. You give them access to tools to kind of do some of the preliminary, maybe the triage level of analysis, so that they can save that time. Well, that's fantastic. What concerns me is I am seeing some, and I won't name names, but I have seen some companies, vendors, come out with AI tooling that does it all, right? And this whole notion of like, well, maybe you don't need an analyst. Maybe we can just hand that to an AI, and that's where things get dangerous, in my opinion. I know a lot of great analysts, and I've used AI. And those two are not the same thing. You really can't replicate, human insights and experience with a complicated if-else statement. So I think it's a balance of those things, but I do think AI is going to be a really, really significant part of the long term. How do we counter threat actors, for sure?
So I want to dig a little into your background, Trevor, and what you do, because it's incredibly fascinating to me. It almost feels like a movie, but a better movie than like Breach, right? Because that was just no comments. But you have to get into the criminal underground, right, to kind of understand what's going on and be able to analyze patterns and what's going on. I think there was a report or an expose you guys did on like the Chinese cybercrime ecosystem, and I just think that is so fascinating. And so I not that you have to reveal any tradecraft secrets, but how do you do all this? Like, where do you even start and how do you kind of infiltrate and get to these gold mines of information where people can start, how do we start addressing this problem?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not all that complicated. And it goes back to the human analyst, right? This is another example of how amazing human beings are. SpyCloud has some fantastic researchers. I would, again, highly biased, but I would say best in the business, what they do. And, really it's about building relationships with these threat actors. At the end of the day, it's easy for us to kind of create a caricature for what a criminal is and have this probably Hollywood inspired view of, some guy sitting in his basement in Severodonetsk and he's got, 17,000 screens around him and matrix terminal windows. Right. And realistically, like, it's just a person, just like you, just like me, that's made different choices, right? So if you approach it from that perspective and you look at it from the perspective of let's build a relationship with this person, they're still a criminal. Obviously, I don't intend them well. I would very much like to see them given a gift of silver bracelets at some point in their life. But until then, the most important thing for us is to maintain visibility. And what that means for SpyCloud, because we collect a lot of data, and that's how we've decided is the best way for us to protect others. That means being as close to the threat actors we can, obviously while remaining morally, ethically, and legally safe, and get access to that data before they can use it, and then get that data to the victim so they can remediate. And we find that that's a very successful method. The internet's forever. You can't get rid of the data. It's still going to be there. But if you're aware of it, you're able to apply countermeasures, right? And I think that is a lot more impactful than just, putting your head in the sand and praying that your expensive tooling is going to protect you.
Was it say hope's not a strategy? Is that what
no, it's not. It is not. And the best plan will always fail upon contact with the enemy. So,
absolutely.
Yes.
Can you talk about any of the findings you found through participating in these digital underground collections and so on?
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. So, my background, I served in the military, and then I went into law enforcement, and I've always been really interested in kind of the psychology or the sociology of crime or delinquents, I guess, in general. And so if you look at it from that perspective, there are some really interesting things that we can learn about the adversaries. Like I already said, they're people just like us. They got hopes, they got dreams, they have plans, they have roadmaps of their own. There's a whole section of this that's very interesting of kind of the intersection of different services and different actors. I talk about the cybercrime enablement services a lot, and really that's how these different things that are built by different people work together. And what we find when we talk to these people is that it's not just by happenstance, right? There's actual relationships that are being built between threat actors where they will essentially have, I mean, sometimes it's to the degree of like profit sharing, right? But even if it's not fully to that, I mean, it's like, hey, your crypto works fantastic. I have an Infostealer. I'd very much like to offer 30 days of, free access to your crypto, and then maybe they're going to renew it. There's these really interesting analogies to like how legitimate business functions, right? Like, hey, I'm going to go on your podcast and people are going to listen to this and they're going to say, oh, SpyCloud, that's kind of a weird name. Let me Google that, right? And so those same kind of, human interactions, they're occurring within the cybercrime ecosystem and really helping proliferate that. So I think that was one of the most interesting things to me personally, is just kind of like, pulling away the caricatured nature of the criminal, and like looking at this as, another ecosystem, another marketplace with shockingly many parallels to, what we do in the legitimate world.
Absolutely. It's, I always thought it was fascinating how they do operate as real organizations. Like I think they have HR departments, some of these criminal, very organized. And I kind of have this, I watch a lot of movies, but I imagine being able to go on the dark web and like I could sign up for like wine of the month and malware of the month. I love it. Subscription services, so easy for me. But I'd be interested in kind of your perspective as we look at the future of these, kind of enablement services and how they're going to evolve and kind of what that means for the future of cybersecurity.
Yeah, well, it doesn't mean anything good. I guess it means we'll stay gainfully employed. Maybe that's a good thing, depending on how you look at it. It goes back to what I was saying earlier with this sophistication is not as necessary as it was. There's a guy. So the term is Trevor. Some of your listeners may be familiar with this. It's basically a group of criminals that will pool their resources together and access, so they can access more malware, more services to deploy that malware at scale, and then they kind of share the proceeds to some degree. So I was talking to this guy that was running a Trevor team, pretty significant, I think about 500,000 infections a month. So pretty high up there in terms of how successful he was. But I was talking to this guy, and it became very clear that he had absolutely zero programming knowledge. In fact, it was funny. He was trying to figure out how to parse the logs that he was logs being data that was stolen from victims. And he was trying to get ChatGPT to write his parsers for him, and he couldn't figure out why it wasn't working. And it just really struck me as it's like, I mean, it's funny, but not like funny, haha, right? Like it's funny concerning, because you've got this guy who has 500,000 people around the world every single month are victimized, untold amount of identity theft, probably some ransomware in there. I mean, just all the horrible experiences this guy's causing. And he's like as competent as my mom, right?
Right.
I love my mom to death, but like I would not name her the linchpin of a criminal organization, right? So it is really. It is really interesting to look at that. And I think from the perspective of like, what does that mean for the larger community? It means we're going to be busy. When the pool was smaller and populated by, a smaller number of more sophisticated actors, it becomes a lot easier to track, right? We can name groups, we can analyze their TTPs. We can build countermeasures. It's a lot harder when it's a bunch of random people on the internet that have complete varying, from nothing all the way up to, uber hacker skill levels. And they all have access to tooling that's, being updated constantly, that has all of these cutting edge features to it. It makes it really a lot more dangerous for us. It means we need to be much more on our game. So yeah, good time to come into cybersecurity for the good guys. And if you're listening to this, please do, because we need help.
Big time.
Yeah, we definitely need all the bright guys joining this team instead of that team. Yeah, maybe like can you go into a little more detail on like what are these info stealers and these tools they're using? How do they operate? And like what are they particularly targeting, right? Like, I mean, we get it, they're after your identities, but there's so many things we have on all of our machines. Like, how do they find the right things to steal?
Yeah.
Right.
So, so info stealers were, I always laugh because, people in computer science, we're probably the least inventive people on the planet. And when it comes to naming things, what's an info stealer? Well, it's something that steals information, right? You got to look that one up. So no, but basically info stealers are just malware, software. Every malware is just software, right? It's just depending on if it's a purpose is legitimate or one that's not. And they're built to steal information from an endpoint. Usually we're talking about, Windows or Mac OS. There are stealers that target mobile devices too. Typically, we refer to those as banking Trojans because they tend to focus much more on financial information, but not exclusively. But generally, we're talking about the passwords that you saved in your browser, the credit card numbers and other related financial information that's saved on your computer. Many of the modern stealers are actually able to exfiltrate full files. So there is this interesting it's not to the degree of ransomware by any means, but we have definitely seen extortion of individuals based on the files that were stolen from them. Other things like, what have you entered into Google, for example, your search history, your download history, what bookmarks have you made? And in the case of Mac OS, we see stealers that actually steal the entire keychain too. So, what that means for the end user is, and end user, I mean criminal, is that they have access to basically your entire digital life, right? If you think about what's on your computer, I mean, it's very much, it's you, right? It's how we all, comport ourselves online. So they can become you. They can take your cookie information and load it into a browser. They typically, advertise as anonymous. I'm doing air quotes for those listening. Anonymous browsers, right? Things like multi-login or Lincoln Sphere. And those will allow you to configure yourself as the victim. My screen size is this. My operating system is this. My keyboard language looks like this. Here's a set of cookies that are valid. And if you can do that, well, cool. Congratulations, you have multi-factor authentication. I don't care. I'm using an already authenticated session, right? I'm passing that authentication cookie to that website. I am you. And then, pulling that even farther out, right? Looking at the other services, we have things like residential proxies. There's a great case a few months ago. 911S5 was a big proxy network run by a guy, a Chinese individual, that had literally billions of dollars worth of fraud traced back to it. And it was allowing criminals to use your device, your phone, your laptop, whatever, as their own proxy and proxy their traffic through, through your Charter, Comcast, whatever residential, ISP, to do their crime. And, I remember talking to the case agents of that years ago, and all kinds of horrible things came from that, right? People getting their doors kicked in because, you're doing things online that the FBI doesn't like. Well, it's not you. You're a victim. You're being victimized. Your computers are being used, against your will, essentially, in that case. So yeah, so it's super complex. I could talk for hours about this, but the bottom line is like the amount of different, it's like Legos, right? You can build whatever you want. You just have to buy the right pieces and make sure they fit together. and you come away with something that, it's not unusual at all to see these actors getting literally thousands of infections, successful infections every single day, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands a week.
I mean, when you combine like what you've talked about together, right? I mean, you're basically talking about unwinding browser fingerprinting, unwinding authentication, unwinding just your identity even as your source IPs. Like a bad guy who can combine all of these together. I mean, it sounds kind of hopeless to be able to fight against that. Like how do we continue to exist against such an adversary with, like you said, it's like Lego pieces to them.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it sounds hopeless. Thankfully, it's not totally hopeless. There are things you can do. But yeah, it is. I mean, honestly, it's an information game, right? It's an information game on the part of the criminals to gain as much information as they possibly can and use it against you. But it's just as much of an information game on our side, on the defender side, right? If I know that my employee, let's use the enterprise perspective here, right? I know my employee's personal device was infected. And I made an oopsie during COVID. I let them log into enterprise, services from their personal device. Whoops, right? We all did it. Okay, well, now I can begin to remediate, right? It is basically at that point, it's a race to the finish line. Who can fix, can I fix the vulnerabilities that I have before the threat actor can use those vulnerabilities? There are definitely some things you can do from a prevention side. I mean, the example that I used, I just listed with cookies, one of the reasons that's such a horrible problem is a lot of cookies have extremely long expiration times. I've seen cookies, like especially email cookies, they're the worst. It's like a year, right? Well, I can get into your email box. I mean, I could do whatever. Maybe I don't know your password, but I could reset your password, right? It's going to send it to your email that I have access to. That alert that, hey, this is an anomalous login activity. Well, guess where that's going? Right into spam, right? So, but you can fix that, right? A lot of times you can change that and you can make your cookie timeout very, very short. Make it 15 minutes or less. Highly unlikely that somebody's going to be able to get in there. Not impossible, but you make it a lot harder on the adversary. And then use other types of notifications or use other types of recovery processes. I have about, this is not an ad for YubiKey, but I've got about 20 of those suckers sitting on my desk right now, which is the height of irritation, of course, and it's entirely my fault. But like, there are products out there that can fix this, right? Or maybe not fix it fully, but certainly make it a lot harder for the adversary. And it's a game of inches. The harder you can make it on the threat actor, right, the less likely they are to succeed.
So to that point, and I think about people, you hear these stories of people who have been compromised and just how hard it was to restore things, to restore their identity back to what it was. And I'm kind of trying to look in the future here, Trevor, and how do we mitigate these things, right? Or how do we kind of insulate or protect ourselves? And is there a future where, I talk a lot about unplugging, right? Let's go old school and do everything manual, but do we need to start creating these online kind of doppelganger personas, almost like as bait, steal what you want, but in the background, I'm me doing stuff offline, and that's how we could kind of have the best of both worlds. I don't know. I'm just riffing here, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah. I won't mention his name, but a friend of mine coined the term identity honeypot.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, at SpyCloud, we talk a lot about holistic identity, right? And that's exactly what we're talking about, right? Like how much of you do I know? Right. And it's sort of a sliding scale, right? If I have your email address and your password, well, maybe I can get into your Netflix account, maybe not. But if I have your email, password, social security number, date of birth, and address, well, now I can file your taxes, right? Mm-hmm. So what you can do about that is make yourself your own identity honeypot. Can muddy the water a lot. A lot of these criminals, what they're doing is they're aggregating data. They're finding different sources of data, maybe malware, maybe breaches, maybe phishing, results, whatever. And then they're kind of doing their own little SQL joins to figure out how that fits together. Well, you can make it a lot harder on them if you use a different date of birth wherever you go. Or, maybe when you sign up under a pseudonym if it's something that you can do legally. Certainly don't do that for taxes. But, obviously don't put your social security number into places that are not going to properly secure those. So you can definitely, I really like the idea of having kind of an identity honeypot and muddy the water for them. Make it harder for them to figure out, is this actually Rachael or is this somebody else? I don't know. I'm gonna ignore that record just in case it's not, right?
I like that. I'm writing that down.
I can't claim it. It was not mine. But...
So it sounds like too like what you're talking about, right? Like this is kind of the first step of multi-stage attacks on these bad guys. Like where do they go in their escalation process? Like how many of these get to ransomware? Where else do they go? And then what do we do to protect against that?
Yeah. Unfortunately, the answer of how many go to ransomware is unfortunately higher than I would like. We do have a section in our malware report that deals specifically with ransomware. We looked at the correlation between Infostealers and ransomware events that we know about. Right, there's a lot of ransomware events that we will never know about, whether they were not published for whatever reason or the ransom was paid. And it's high, right? I mean, we know there's a correlation here. We know which makes sense, right? Ransomware really at its heart is an access problem. If the ransomware actors can't gain access, well, there's never going to be a ransomware, right? Especially these days when we look at a lot of the ransom events that happen, have a component. It's not just encryption. Encryption might be a part of it, but a lot of them are there's exfiltration. There's it's kind of the name and shame way of doing it. I'm going to post your information on my leak site, and I'm going to threaten to release your data unless you pay me. It's proven very successful, so that's why the actors are doing this. But if you can go back in time, I mean, obviously none of us can, but if we can imagine that, hey, if they didn't have that access, then they would not have been able to do that. Nothing would have been exfiltrated. They're effectively you've mitigated the event. So that's not to say that access only comes from Infostealers. Certainly does not. There's many other ways that the ransomware actors get access to a network, but Infostealers are definitely on that list, and they're one that is probably the easiest to remediate. Right? Somebody's going to launch some 0 day against you. Well, it's a 0 day, right? Like, by definition, you are not going to know about that before it happens. But right. If I know that, hey, I have this really risky admin panel that's been hanging out there for the past 10 years and doesn't have MFA and it's issuing cookies that are valid for 365 days, well, that's something that you can fix, right? You can fix that in your environment. Or if you have the ability, through a company like SpyCloud to identify that infection as having occurred, well, then you can remediate it for that employee, right? So there are ways to approach this that are very successful. It just requires the knowledge from the defender perspective and the intent to take those steps to really fix it.
It's I do want to. I mentioned this quote though, just for funsies that was on the Chinese cybercrime ecosystem. It said, "The data you leave on the internet knows you better than your mother," which I guess that was on a China-based blog on social engineering techniques. I just thought that was fascinating. It almost feels like when, not if, right? These things are going to happen with identity. And I'm kind of curious. There's a couple of things. How does the monetization piece happen? Like I imagine like a swap meet or something, and it's a bulk. You can bolt this, But for those that like a little competition, how do you know how valuable your information is? I mean, maybe I want to be a little bit more on the higher end, not the lower end. But I'm just kind of curious, like how the valuation can work.
Yeah, I mean it's funny. There isn't this swap meet. I like that. That's kind of fun to picture. It kind of is like that. Yeah, I mean, it's very platform dependent, I would say. If you look at criminal forums, depending on there's a whole ecosystem of forums I could talk about with English speaking and Russian speaking and ne'er the two shall meet and all that. But there definitely is like that there is that side of it where it's a let me look at what other people have for sale and let me adjust my prices accordingly. There's another aspect though that I feel like people kind of don't really focus on as much. The financial is certainly important, but a lot of these actors are motivated just as much, honestly, if not more, by clout, by gaining reputation, right? We see even down to, it's been a lot of reporting on the comm lately, which is kind of this community of highly aggressive, young, typically men that are committing crimes, physical and cyber, right? And cloud is like everything right there. Your reputation is so important. But that's also true for kind of the higher tiers. One of the reasons that some of the recent disruptions that have happened of these cybercrime like op endgame is awesome, right? They're coming out there with this video and they're like putting out these people's like embarrassing photos on a government website. Part of the reason that's so successful is because you're tearing apart their reputation. They are now fully exposed. I mean, it's embarrassing for part of it. But the other side of it is like, look, your OPSEC sucks, right? Clearly, your face is on a website, a government website. Like, you are compromised, and that's hard to recover from. I mean, essentially, those people, largely have to go away and come back under a different name. Right. So just kind of shows you how important their reputation is to them. So again, I think the financial aspect of it is very important. I don't want to diminish that at all, but right. There's another part of it which is just, hey, I'm going to share this data because it makes me look cool, right. And all my friends will say, hey, great job, and then maybe I'll sell it later.
That's I think a little bit about and in recent years, I guess when you want to beat these kind of things, are we going to become a society where we're like, all right, well, I guess my dirty laundry. Oh, well, whoopsie, and it doesn't become a big deal. I mean, is that kind of what we're working towards as a society, where it just gets a little, all right, it's out there. Maybe it's kind of freeing. I don't know.
I hope not. Yeah, I hope not. It's interesting. You mentioned China, and we do a lot of work. One of my researchers, a fantastic China researcher. She's brilliant. She did that piece you were referencing previously. Her and one other researcher. She's really highlighted one of the interesting things about the Chinese ecosystem is, we, and when I say we, I am referring to the West, U.S., Europe, that kind of group. We get enraged when something happens, right? Like I remember when I was in government when the OPM breach happened, and it pissed everybody off, right? It's like, oh my gosh, my data is not secure. Now China knows all my information. There really doesn't happen the same way in China. There's China and Chinese people, unfortunately, have kind of realized that their information is not private. Right. It's not private from the government. It's not private from individuals. And this concept of Big Brother is maybe not fully accepted, but it's certainly acknowledged much more than it is for us here. So I think that's kind of that's the shadow that we need to avoid. I really hope that we never get to that point where, my social security number being on the internet is a foregone conclusion. Right. I do really hope that we, in the Western world, can align ourselves in such a way to make that unlikely. And so that 10 years from now, when my kids are in their first data breach, they can get angry about it, as they should, yeah. Right? Instead of just assuming that, it's bound to happen.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, well, I think all of the we you're talking about, right? Like we still really don't want our data out there. I think, things like data brokers and so on are very scary to us. But how do we stop that proliferation of data, right? If the data's not there to be stolen, isn't that better? Do government regulations like GDPR and CCPA play a role in that? And do they help protect us? And what else should be being done?
Yeah, I think GDPR went a long way. I am a fan. It will shock absolutely no one that I'm a bit of a privacy absolutist. So yes, I definitely think any kind of regulation. It's a fine line to tread. We don't want regulation to the point where it stymies innovation, but we do need regulation that is that forces compliance with some of the very obvious things. You mentioned data brokers. There's a lot that you can do. You can opt out. When you see that little pop-up that asks if you want to enable cookies, what that's really telling you is, hey, do you want to be tracked? Because online, the cookies that are being dropped, the vast majority, 90% plus, have nothing to do with anything you care about. They have everything to do with tracking your activity online. And it ranges from a referral type stuff, so that, hey, if I find the website through Google, I want to make sure that the website knows that I came from Google, right? Or if I came through ChatGPT, I want to make sure there's marketing reasons that's an important thing. But there's a lot more kind of less savory things that those tracking cookies do. And that's why if you're on Facebook and you've been shopping around for a tent, all of a sudden, hey, why am I seeing so many ads for tents? Well, it's because Facebook knows, right? And so it's tailoring your ads to deliver that. And maybe that's a good thing. I've certainly bought ads that I've seen. I'm ashamed to admit. Tailored advertising does work, but it is definitely it is a compromise, right? If Facebook knows, well, maybe I'm okay with Facebook knowing, right? Maybe I trust Facebook. But what happens if that data wasn't just sold to Facebook? What if that data was sold to somebody that is maybe less interested in selling you something and maybe more interested in selling you, right? Your data. Or maybe not, and maybe they just really suck at their security and they're dumping all that data to an Elastic cluster that's exposed without a password, right? So the proliferation, that's a hard word to say, the proliferation of our information is worrisome. But there are things that you can do about it. And again, I think that's where I like to see regulation is allow me to make the decision. Give me the choice to say, nope, don't put that cookie on my device. Thank you very much. I'll go about my day.
I've noticed some of those, and maybe I just can't see the little X, but you do go, particularly on the phone, some of these websites, and it doesn't even give you a choice, really. I mean, you have to kind of accept or you can't move on. And then I'm like, well, I guess I won't be shopping with these people anymore. But I would love it to get more granular control like that. So tell me if this is correct. I guess there was some recent SpyCloud research. It's really interesting. The average individual has as many as 52 unique usernames, emails, and 221 passwords exposed on the dark net across personal and professional identities, which is crazy to me. It's how do we need to start rethinking identity security? And I don't know, is that face? Is it, DNA but how can we kind of start thinking about this maybe a little bit differently to make it a little bit harder?
Yeah, it is scary. When I first started working for SpyCloud a couple years ago, I just left the government, and one of the first things I did, I ran my email and my wife's email in SpyCloud, and I went, oh, that sucks. Right? It's like, that's not, I wish, maybe ignorance is bliss. I didn't want to know that. But no, it varies from person to person. It varies with your age, especially. Right. If you look at somebody that's quite young, we talk about digital exhaust, right? Your digital exhaust kind of grows proportional to your online activity. So those of us that are hyper online and have done so for 20, 30 years, we have a lot of digital exhaust. So again, it's scary. I think it's important that people recognize that and are aware that their data is out there. Maybe SpyCloud's pretty good at aggregating that, but we don't own the trademark on aggregation, right? Criminals can aggregate data too. So you bring up biometrics. I think biometrics is definitely a part of the solution. I use face unlock for a lot of things. Your fingerprints can work quite well. There's other types of authentication through hardware tokens that can certainly make things more difficult. It's not going to solve the entire problem, right? It's holistic is a pretty important part of the holistic identity. There's a lot of other things that can happen, especially nowadays. We're 2 months away from tax day. Well, actually, 2 months and a day as of the recording. And that's so there's, but again, it's a game of inches, right? Limit your exposure as much as you possibly can. Be aware of what's out there. I'd recommend anybody to go to checkyourexposure.com. You can put in your Gmail account, whatever you want. We'll tell you what's out there for you. That's a good step. Find out what the criminal might know about you, remediate those, and then from then on, limit your digital exhaust as much as you possibly can.
I'm making notes.
So, Trevor, you began in the Army. How did this experience impact your view of the cybercrimes, and how has this shaped your career? You've given us so much info today, right? It's obvious that you've been through a lot of this already.
Yeah.
Can I add on to that though too, John? Because the other piece of this that I'm always fascinated about, when you were a little boy, Trevor, growing up, you're like, I really want to go into cybersecurity, or was it kind of a more winding path that brought you to the Army and this career?
Yeah, that's funny. Oh man, I'm gonna get ribbed for this. I always wanted to be an FBI agent. That was my goal. So I wanted to be in the FBI, which I guess there's a checkbox next to that in a way. I did work for the FBI. Wasn't an FBI agent, but I was a special agent.
Nice.
Just for the DoD.
How fun.
No, I joined the Army. I joined the Army as it's called a forward observer. So I was essentially attached to infantry platoons to provide terminal guidance for artillery and mortars and aircraft delivered munitions and all that kind of stuff. Nothing the farthest away from cybersecurity you could think of. Yeah. I became a special agent with Army CID after doing that for a while, and quickly realized that responding to crime scenes at 3 a.m. was not really my favorite activity. Yeah. And I did grow up. My dad was an electrical engineer, so I grew up around computers. I grew up working on computers. I knew how to code a little bit. Didn't really enjoy it, but I could. And so that was kind of a natural transition, I think, for me to go into cybersecurity at the federal level. And I stuck with that. I did, I guess 6 years, 7 years, something like that. In federal service, ended up getting the chance to go and work on an FBI cyber task force towards the end there. Worked some fantastic cases with some great agents and analysts. Learned a ton. And, that really has, it was kind of my formative years, I guess. And then coming into the private sector is very much a continuation of that. I think one of the most amazing things, the thing that really drew me to cybersecurity is, I guess two things. One is you'll never do the same thing twice. It is a constant. If you're not learning every single day, then I imagine you're sleeping every day. Yes. I don't know how you can do this and not learn constantly, which I personally think is so much fun. I am absolutely the most ADHD person on the earth. I do not like doing the same thing for more than a few minutes at a time. So context switching is an A+ for me. And cybersecurity allows that. So that's number one. And then the second thing is, it sounds cliche, but I really like making a difference. That's why I went into law enforcement. And I feel like, cybersecurity, you can make a huge impact. I remember when I was working general crimes, you'd respond to a horrific situation. Somebody has the worst day of their life. And for that person and that person's family, that is a huge event, right? And you can do a fantastic job. You can work that case. You can take care of the victims, the witnesses, make sure that you bring justice to them. And that's hugely fulfilling. But it's a limited impact, right? I mean, I don't want to minimize that, but it is a point in time. And it's after the fact. And that's the thing that's really hard. It was really hard for me is, there's not a lot of prevention there. There's showing up and making sure you're doing right by the victim and by the justice system. But what the bad thing has already happened. And so what I think is really cool about cybersecurity is not only can you have a massive impact, I mean, protecting millions, if not billions of accounts every single day. And each one of those accounts is a person, right? There's a human being that has their hopes and dreams behind that. But you can also prevent the crimes from happening in the beginning. And that's really that's the holy grail of law enforcement, right? I don't want to show up to the crime scene. I don't want there to be a crime scene. Let me make it so that crime scene never has to happen. Nobody has to be victimized. And so I love that. I love that about cybersecurity. And I don't think I'll ever leave.
Yeah, it's a great industry. We were talking about that, I think, last week. Just the learning something new every day. I can't imagine another industry where you have that opportunity and it changes so much. So it feels good to learn. I just everything about that. Now, I think I have to, I don't know if this is the obvious question, but maybe you've seen so much in your career, Trevor. You've been behind the curtain and all of these things. I mean, is there anything that even surprises you anymore?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Okay.
definitely. Yeah, I'm constantly surprised. In good ways and bad ways. It's a little bit of both. If I don't know, the threat actor never ceases to amaze me. I've arrested these guys. I've sat in the courtroom as they got convicted and sentenced. I've gone on extradition flights and sat next to some poor dude in handcuffs for 6 hours. There's still new stuff every single day. I will hear about something some threat actor did or some criminal did, and it's like, didn't have that on my bingo card. Which, sometimes it's funny and sometimes it's sad, but it's always entertaining.
It's probably got to feel good. I think you said that recently there was, someone got some jail time from a case that you were working in. I imagine that feels really good because that's not always the case, right? When it comes to these kind of crimes.
Yeah. That was the guy's name is Mark Sokolovsky. He was one of the developers of the Raccoon Infostealer. And in this last December in 2024, he pled guilty and he was sentenced. That's, it sounds kind of, it sounds kind of bad to say you're glad that somebody's in jail. But like the way that I look at it is, we don't get those wins all the time. Right. I mean, that was a crazy story. He was in Ukraine. The war kicked off. He fled Ukraine, happened to go to the Netherlands, which is, a great partner to the United States. And they were able and willing to arrest him and then extradite him. And there's so much. I mean, I could talk for weeks about that whole case and all the steps. But, because we don't always get that resolution. Right. In fact, usually we don't. A lot of these cyber criminals, a lot of these guys that are really top tier. They're sitting in places where the government doesn't care. They're not attacking their citizens; they're attacking our citizens. So there really isn't a lot of the actual enforcements. The silver bracelets part of it doesn't always happen. So to see that happen, especially, one of the great things about that case was there was restitution that was ordered as part of that. So, hopefully some amount of the people that were victimized had their identity stolen, had their lives disrupted, can get some financial compensation for that from him. I think maybe this is me looking at it through rose-colored glasses, but I do think there is a chilling effect of that, right? I have to imagine that there's some other cyber criminal somewhere that sees that and reads the press release and goes, maybe this isn't where I want to spend my time. Maybe this isn't quite as lucrative as I thought it was, and chooses to not go into that line of work.
That would be nice. Yeah. I think it probably happens too. It's accountability. I think a while ago, right, 10 years ago, accountability was almost impossible for these kind of things, or attribution, I should say. And now it's encouraging to see over the years how we're getting more sophisticated, right? The hunters are getting more sophisticated in how we can track down these criminals, and that's a really cool feeling. I imagine. Yeah.
It's a cool feeling. I do think, though, what makes me most optimistic is actually not, I'm proud of that case. I'm proud I opened that case and we closed it with an arrest and a prosecution and sentencing. But I really love the trend, I would say, over the past 2 years, maybe 3, depending on how you slice it, where it started in Europe. US is definitely getting to be very on board, where it's disruption first, right? Hey, we can indict this guy on however many counts of various, wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud and computer fraud and abuse, whatever. He's going to print that out. He's going to stick it up on his wall. It's a trophy, right? Yep. Well, all right. Well, what if we can really screw up this guy's life, right? Yes. Like, what if we can grab those pictures from his iCloud account and that embarrassing Facebook photo that he thought he deleted and make a montage and stick it up on a website somewhere and, publish a GitHub repo with all of his customers' names and their information. I mean, it's like doxing for the good guys, right? Yep. It's a different outcome. There's, Mark sitting in a cell right now. Those people are not going to sit in a cell probably ever. But we screwed up their lives, right? We made an activating event for them, and they were made sad. So I think if we can make bad people sad, then it's still a win. And we don't really need to compare the two. They're both wins.
I like that. So I do want to be mindful of time. I know we've run kind of long, but it's honestly, Trevor, we could have a whole podcast of you just talking about, all the things that you've done in your career, because it's just so fascinating. But I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. So Trevor, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been so fascinating, this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor.
To all of our listeners out there, Jonathan, we know what we like to tell our listeners, right? Every week you gotta smash. I'm gonna get you, Jonathan. Smash
that
the like button.
Oh yes.
Yes. So you can, get a fresh episode in your inbox or on your, your podcast platform of choice. And as always, please leave us comments. We'd love to hear back from you. On topics you want us to cover and what you're interested in. So once again, thanks everyone for joining us this week. And until next time, stay safe.